The teacup went down wrong. Not dropped. Nothing so dramatic as that. Colonel Finch simply set it back in its saucer with a small, sharp click, the kind of sound a man makes when something has displeased him. But he hasn't yet decided to say so. His hand remained on the handle a moment longer than necessary. Then he released it. Miss Marple, seated 3 garden chairs to his left, with a box of participation ribbons in her lap, noticed. She noticed also that he didn't reach for the cup again. The Chipping Morton Village Garden Show had been running since 10:30, and it was now nearly 2 in the afternoon, which meant the serious business of the trophies was approaching, and the atmosphere on the Larkspur Cottage lawn had taken on that particular quality of English social tension. Everyone smiling rather more than they meant to, everyone watching everyone else from the corners of their eyes. Colonel Finch's marigold beds were, as usual, extraordinary. 7 consecutive years he'd taken the top prize, and there was something in the way he stood beside them, chest forward, hands clasped behind his back, that suggested he considered the judging a formality. "Magnificent this year," said Mrs. Croft from the Women's Institute, pausing to admire a particularly dense border. "The Colonel really does have a gift." "He has a gardener," murmured Mrs. Prout, not quite under her breath. The Colonel didn't hear. Or perhaps he did and chose not to. He was already moving toward the refreshments table, where his wife Dorothea stood pouring tea with the practised ease of a woman who has performed this particular social function so many times it required no thought at all. She wore a cream linen dress, well cut, slightly dated, and her auburn hair was pinned up so tightly it gave her face a strained, attentive look, as though she were listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Gerald Hartley stood beside her. He was talking, something mild and pleasant, the sort of conversation solicitors make at social occasions, all reassuring half-sentences and warm nods. Dorothea smiled at whatever he said. It was a perfectly ordinary smile. Her eyes didn't change at all when she smiled. Miss Marple filed this away and turned her attention back to the ribbons, which were tangled. The afternoon continued in its usual fashion. Mr. Bassett won the vegetable category, with a marrow of truly unsettling proportions. The Reverend Clement's wife presented the floral arrangement prizes with such evident relief that the whole business was nearly done, that several people laughed. Children ran between the garden tables. Someone's spaniel escaped twice. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had not been asked to judge anything this year despite her very strong feelings on the matter, stationed herself near the tea table and offered opinions to anyone who slowed down sufficiently. The Colonel collected his trophy at 2:10. He held it the way he always held it, not triumphantly, but as a man receives what is correctly his. He said the right words. People applauded. Dorothea stood slightly behind him and to the left, holding her teacup in both hands. Miss Marple watched Gerald Hartley watch Dorothea. Just for a moment. A fraction of a moment. Really, the length of time it takes to look at something you're trying not to look at. Then his eyes moved away, back to the vicar, back to the conversation he was supposed to be having. His face gave nothing. He had, Miss Marple thought, a very disciplined face.
Welcome. Today we delve into the enigma of the post office and the garden. A garden fete is always such a pleasant affair, isn't it? I have always found that watching people around a tea table tells you more than any newspaper. The postmark reads St. Mary Mead, and the village bake sale was last Tuesday. Curious indeed.
Tick, tock,
They are already whispering. The Colonel hasn't even been moved from the grass, and the village web is spinning.
7 consecutive years he won the trophy for his marigolds. A man used to get exactly what he wanted.
The sudden end of Colonel Finch. It takes me back to a family I once knew, the Purvises. A garden fete is like a chessboard. Everyone has their specific moves. It was a terribly awkward afternoon, wasn't it? So much forced politeness, so many fake smina. I always find it useful to write down my observations. Memory can be a tricky thing as we age.
The Colonel took one sip of his tea, the same cup Dorothea had poured, and set it down with that small, sharp click. 20 minutes later, he was on the grass. It happened quickly, and it didn't. Those who witnessed it afterward described it differently, as people always do. Some said he staggered first. Some said he simply sat down rather suddenly. One small boy near the rose border said with great authority that the Colonel had gone the colour of old putty before he fell. Dr. Trent, who had been at the far end of the garden arguing pleasantly with Mr. O'Bassett about whether competitive vegetable growing had any dignity, reached him in perhaps 90 seconds. By 3 o'clock, Colonel Aubrey Finch was dead. "Heart failure," said Dr. Trent, in the careful tone of a man who means probably heart failure. The Colonel had been 68, had a documented cardiac history, had served in conditions that had left their marks on more than one organ. These things happened. Miss Marple sat in her garden chair long after most people had moved away. Some helping, some simply frozen in that particular English paralysis that overtakes people when something has happened, and no one has told them what they're meant to do. She sat with the ribbons still in her lap and thought about 3 things. The teacup set down with that small sound of displeasure. Rose Binns, the parlour maid, it who had gone very white when the Colonel collapsed. Not the white of shock, Miss Marple thought, but the white of a person who has been expecting something and cannot quite believe it has arrived. She had slipped away before the ambulance. Miss Marple had watched her go, and Gerald Hartley, who had crossed to the kitchen at some point in the confusion, and stood at the sink washing his hands, carefully, thoroughly, with the particular attention of a man removing something he did not wish to leave traces of. It was, of course, entirely possible that he had simply wished to wash his hands. People did. Miss Marple rolled the remaining ribbons into a neat cylinder and placed them in the box. She thought it was not entirely probable.
The death. Curious. The garden? A motive? A most intriguing case. A single sip of tea, a sharp click against a saucer. They say he went the colour of old putty before he fell. Poor Colonel Finch. People freeze when tragedy strikes, don't they? The English paralysis, I call it. Dead by 3 o'clock. Dr. Trent sounded so certain. The garden show ended in a shroud. A dark wool blanket pulled over a man who thought he owned the world. Did you notice the way the Colonel staggered? A proud man, brought down so heavily. 68 years old. A full life brought to a halt in 90 seconds. One of the great benefits of old age is that we stop seeing what we expect. The same cup Dorothea poured, the very same one. It makes you wonder about the person sitting across from you at breakfast, doesn't it? The sun has set on the Chipping Morton garden show. A man is dead.
The news moved through Chipping Morton in the way news always moved, not in a straight line, but in a web, but touching each household according to its connections. By 6 o'clock, Mrs. Finch had been visited by the vicar's wife, the doctor, and 2 members of the Women's Institute. by 7, the version of events circulating at the pub had the Colonel poisoned by a foreign visitor. No one could identify the visitor, but this detail seemed to strengthen rather than weaken the theory. By 8:30, Miss Marple had received 3 telephone calls. From Mrs. Price Ridley, from her friend Mrs. Bantry in Much Benham, and from her nephew Raymond, who had heard nothing specific, but had some instinct that his aunt was involved and simply rang to check. She told all 3 of them that it was very sad and that the Colonel had seemed perfectly well at the show, which was true. She did not mention the teacup. She did not mention Rose Binns. She did not, particularly, mention Gerald Hartley. After the calls, she sat by the window with her knitting and the last of the evening light, and thought about a family called the Purvises, who had kept a draper's shop in St. Mary Mead 20-odd years ago. Mr. Purvis had been a quiet man, almost invisible, the sort of person who seemed to shrink when his wife was in the room, as though he required less space than ordinary men. He had spent most of each day in the back room of the shop, doing, Mrs. Purvis always said with a pleasant smile, the accounts. He hadn't been doing the accounts. What Miss Marple had found interesting, then and now, was not what Mr. Purvis had actually been doing. It was the smile, the way Mrs. Purvis had continued to serve customers, to attend church socials, to make the right conversational noises, and while knowing perfectly well what was happening in the back room. She had been comfortable with the arrangement. That was the word, comfortable. It had suited her. Dorothea Finch had stood behind her husband and slightly to the left when he received his trophy. Her eyes had moved once, briefly, involuntarily, toward Gerald Hartley. The knitting needles clicked steadily. Comfortable, Miss Marple thought. That's the word. Miss Marple went to the post office on Friday morning, ostensibly for stamps. She required, she told Mrs. Prout, a book of first class and perhaps some of the commemorative ones if they had them. The ones with the birds. Her nephew Raymond had developed an interest in philately, or claimed to have, although Miss Marple suspected this was more to do with a young woman at the sorting office in London than any genuine love of postal history. Still, one supported one's nephew's enthusiasms. Mrs. Prout, who had been postmistress of Chipping Morton for 19 years, and had in that time developed what could only be described as a professional relationship with other people's business, produced the stamps with one hand and leaned on the counter with the other. Terrible business, she said. The Colonel. Very sad, agreed Miss Marple. Heart, they're saying. So, I understand. Mrs. Prout's eyes, which were small and very bright, like a robin's, moved over Miss Marple's face with the practised assessment of a woman who has sorted mail long enough to know when an envelope contains something more interesting than a bill. You were there, she said, at the show. I was helping with the ribbons. You saw it happen. I saw him fall, yes. This was not, strictly speaking, what Mrs. Prout had meant, and both women knew it. There was a small pause in which the question hung between them like weather. That Mr. Swan was there as well, Mrs. Prout said, in the tone of someone offering information they have been saving. The one who bought Mulberry Cottage. He stood near the back, by the gate. I noticed because he doesn't really, she paused, searching for the right village terminology, mix, keeps to himself, city type. He's an art dealer, I believe, said Miss Marple. So, he says. Mrs. Prout's tone expressed considerable reservations about art dealing as a profession, and about Oliver Swan in particular. He's had letters. From London, mostly. But 2 from Dorset. Same handwriting both times, which I noticed because the address was written with one of those very thick nibs. You don't see that much anymore." She paused with the precision of someone who has just revealed exactly as much as she intended to. "I don't know who writes from Dorset with a thick nib." Miss Marple, who had a reasonable idea but said nothing of it, thanked Mrs. Prout for the stamps and walked home by the longer route, the one that took her past Gerald Hartley's cottage on Vicarage Lane. It was a well-kept garden. She had always thought so. Nothing showy, but maintained with real attention. A good rose border along the front wall, lavender edging the path, and at the far end, tucked between the compost heap and the garden shed, a stretch of mixed bulb planting that in spring would have been rather lovely, and Miss Marple walked slowly. The autumn crocus section, Colchicine autumnale, she noted, easily recognizable by the leaf pattern even now in summer dormancy, occupied a border approximately 4 feet long. She was no expert, but she had grown them herself years ago, and she knew how they looked. She knew also because she had once helped nurse a neighbouring farmer's dog who had eaten several of the corms, that every part of the plant contained colchicine in quantities sufficient to cause very serious harm. The border had been recently disturbed. Not vandalism, nothing so obvious. But the soil at one end had the look of ground that has been turned and patted back, carefully, by someone who knew what they were doing and wanted the disturbance to pass unnoticed. A patch of bare earth, no larger than a dinner plate, was where something had been removed. Miss Marple did not stop walking. She did not slow her pace or look at the border, for longer than any idle passer-by might look at a garden. She continued to Daisy Cottage, made herself a cup of tea, and sat for a long time in the kitchen with both hands around the cup, thinking. Then she telephoned Dr. Trent.
A trip to the post office is never just about stamps, is it? Mrs. Prout has sorted the village mail for 19 years. Colchicine autumnale, the autumn crocus. I sat in this very kitchen for a long time after my walk.
People are so quick to blame outsiders, aren't they? Mrs. Prout was certain Mr. Swan was the centre of this tragedy.
14 months of letters from Dorset, a sudden death, a missing plant root.
I stood right here and looked at his lavender and his roses.
Years ago, I helped nurse a farmer's dog. It was a terrible, agonizing thing. We carry these memories. Mrs. Prout offered her gossip like currency, hoarding the details about the thick-nibbed pen. To know something one doesn't know what to do with, it is a frightening weight. Poor little Rose Binns is carrying that weight right now.
The Colonel's death was written off as a tired heart. But we know better now, don't we?
"I wonder," she said when he answered, "whether you might do something for me. It's rather a delicate matter, and I may be entirely wrong. I often am, as you know, but it has been bothering me since Thursday, and I find I can't quite leave it alone." There was a pause on the line. Dr. Trent had known Miss Marple for 11 years, long enough to understand that when she said she might be entirely wrong, and she had usually already arrived at a conclusion, and was giving him the opportunity to reach it alongside her. "What is it?" he said. "The Colonel's teacup," said Miss Marple. "I wonder if anyone thought to examine it before Rose washed it." Another pause. Longer. Rose washed the teacup. Almost immediately. I noticed her. She collected several things from the refreshments table very shortly after the Colonel fell. Quite efficiently, really. It struck me at the time as slightly— Miss Marple paused, selecting the word with care. "Premature, Miss Marple." His voice had changed. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything at all," she said pleasantly. I simply thought that if Dr. Ramachandran in London, I believe you know him, don't you? You've mentioned him once or twice. If he were able to examine certain things, it might set everyone's minds at rest. Or not, of course. She could hear him thinking. There may be nothing in it, she added. I am an elderly woman who notices things that aren't necessarily significant. The Colonel was 68 with a documented heart condition. These things do happen. They do, said Dr. Trent. But then, said Miss Marple quietly, so do other things. He said he would make inquiries. She thanked him and rang off and went back to her knitting and didn't think about Gerald Hartley washing his hands at the kitchen sink, carefully, thoroughly, for quite some time. Oliver Swan opened his front door on Saturday morning, looking like a man who had not slept well, and was not surprised to find a small, elderly woman standing on his step with an inquiring expression. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," said Miss Marple. "I noticed your hall last week through the open door when I was walking past, and there was a watercolour I thought I recognised, a Wiltshire scene, I believe. My late cousin had something rather similar, and I've always wondered about the artist. I thought perhaps, as you're in the trade, you might—" "Come in," said Oliver Swan. The hall was as she'd remembered. The watercolour, a competent piece, nothing remarkable, hung beside the coat rack. The rest of the cottage was lived in, but impersonal. The way rented places look when someone has been there long enough to make a mess, but not long enough to make a home. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any, which she found she rather liked. "You were at the garden show," he said, setting a cup before her. "I was helping with the ribbons." "You noticed me." "I notice most people," said Miss Marple. "It's an old woman's habit. One has so little else to occupy one." He looked at her steadily. He had a long, carefully arranged face, the kind of face that had learned to give very little away and had been practicing for decades. But there was something behind it now, something that had been there since Thursday, sitting on him like weather. "I know why you're here," he said, "and it isn't the watercolour." "No," agreed Miss Marple, "it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his own cup and looked at the table between them with the expression of a man making a decision he's been postponing for several days. "I've been gathering evidence," he said, "for the past 6 weeks, on behalf of a client." "The Colonel's son," said Miss Marple. Miss Swan looked up sharply. "From Dorset," she added, "the letters with the thick nib." He was quiet for another moment. "His name is Philip Finch. He's 41, lives in Wareham. He and his father had been estranged for 4 years, the second marriage, but recently Philip became concerned. About the estate accounts. There were withdrawals he couldn't account for, money moving in ways that seemed," he paused, "irregular. Gerald Hartley manages the estate." "Managed," said Swan. He said it with a flatness that meant something. "And the visits to Larkspur Cottage." "I was trying to get close enough to document the relationship between Mrs. Finch and Hartley. There were letters. I've seen references to them in other correspondence. Philip believed they'd been involved for over a year." He looked at her directly. "I was building a case. I was nearly there. And then the Colonel died," said Miss Marple. "Thursday," said Swan. "Yes." He stood up abruptly, went to a writing desk in the corner, and returned with a folder. It was not particularly thick, but it had the dense, considered weight of careful work. He placed it on the table between them. "Letters," he said, "references. Bank records Philip obtained through his own solicitor. Nothing proving murder. I hadn't any reason to expect murder. I was looking for fraud. But this," he tapped the folder. establishes the relationship, the motive, and the timeline. 14 months. Miss Marple didn't touch the folder immediately. She looked at it. "You said you were nearly there," she said. "What stopped you?" Swan's jaw tightened slightly. "A conversation I overheard 3 weeks ago, within the lane beside the cottage. Hartley and Mrs. Finch, outside in the garden, late evening. I caught only part of it." He paused. "He said something about the garden remedy. She said she didn't want to know the details. He said she didn't need to." The kitchen was very quiet. "The garden remedy," said Miss Marple. "I didn't know what it meant. I assumed something about the estate, a financial arrangement. I wrote it down and moved on." He looked at her steadily. "I understand now what it meant." Miss Marple picked up the folder. She looked through it slowly, methodically, with the thoroughness of a woman who has learned that details overlooked the first time have a habit of mattering the second. When she had finished, she closed it and set it back on the table. "May I ask you to keep this safe?" she said. "Yeah, for perhaps a few more days. For the police. For Dr. Trent," she said, "to begin with." Swan nodded. He looked, she thought, like a man from whom a considerable weight had been partially lifted, not removed, but redistributed into more manageable proportions. "I should have gone to someone sooner," he said. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but you went to someone now. That is generally sufficient." She finished her coffee, thanked him for the watercolour information she had technically never received, and walked home through the village in the warm July morning, with the folder's contents arranged in her mind like a garden, each piece in its proper place, the whole shape visible now if one simply stepped back far enough to see it. She thought about Gerald Hartley's hands at the sink. She thought about the disturbed earth in the crocus border. She thought about Dorothea's eyes moving left, just once, just briefly, in the first 30 seconds after her husband fell. Comfortable, she thought again. That had always been the word. Rose Binns had given her notice on Friday morning. Miss Marple learned this from Mrs. Prout naturally, who had learned it from the ironmonger's wife, whose husband had told her that the young woman renting the room above the shop had paid her a week's rent in full, in cash, on Friday afternoon, and had asked whether she might leave her trunk for collection, rather than carrying it herself, as she would be taking only what she could manage on the bus. The bus to Chipping Norton left at 9:15 on weekday mornings. It was now Sunday, and Miss Marple put on her second-best hat, the grey one with the small brim that she wore for occasions that required looking entirely unthreatening, and walked to the ironmonger's on Mill Street. Rose answered the knock herself. She was a small young woman, 22 or perhaps 23, with the careful neatness of someone who has grown up without much, and has learned to make it look like choice. Brown hair, grey eyes, or perhaps brown, the light on the landing was poor. She wore a cotton dress with a Peter Pan collar, and she was holding a folded cardigan against her chest with both arms, the way people hold things when their hands need something to do. She looked at Miss Marple. Then she looked at the stairs behind Miss Marple, as though calculating something. "I'm not from the police," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I'm not from anyone, really. My name is Miss Marple, and I live at Daisy Cottage on the Burford Road, and I was at the garden show on Thursday, helping with the ribbons, and I wondered whether I might come in for a moment. I won't keep you long." Rose's grip on the cardigan tightened. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said. "Yes, I know. I thought I'd come today then." There was a pause. It was the kind of pause that could go in either direction, toward the door closing or toward it opening further, and Miss Marple waited through it without moving, without pressing, without doing anything at all except looking at Rose Binns with the particular expression she had developed over many decades. Not sympathy exactly, not authority, but something closer to simple recognition. I see you. I know you're frightened. I am not the thing you are frightened of. Rose stepped back from the door. The room was small and clean and almost entirely packed. The trunk sat open in the corner, nearly full. A coat hung on the hook behind the door. On the windowsill, a small pot of African violets, the only personal thing in the room, the only thing that had not yet been packed, caught the morning light and held it. Rose sat on the edge of the bed. Miss Marple took the single wooden chair, turned it slightly so she was not directly facing the girl, and arranged her handbag on her lap. "You were at the show," Rose said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." "I saw you. With the ribbons." A pause. "You sat near the Colonel." "A little way from him, yes." Rose looked at the African violets, and her jaw was set in the particular way of someone who has made a decision, and is rehearsing it internally, repeating it to themselves like a lesson. "I am saying nothing. I am leaving tomorrow. I know nothing. It is very frightening," said Miss Marple conversationally, "to know something one doesn't know what to do with. I've experienced it myself once or twice. There's a particular sort of weight to it. One thinks about it at odd moments. Waking in the night, walking to the shops." Rose said nothing. And then when someone suggests that one might share the weight, that's frightening in a different way. Because sharing it makes it real, doesn't it? While one keeps it to oneself, it remains somehow contained. The cardigan was still clutched against Rose's chest. "He said," she began, then stopped. Miss Marple waited. He said accidents happen to girls who talk too much." Rose's voice was entirely flat. She had removed all expression from it with the thoroughness of someone wringing water from a cloth. "He smiled when he said it. That was—" She stopped again. "That was the worst part," said Miss Marple, not as a question. "Yes." A breath. The smiling. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below, the ironmonger was moving things. The dull clank of metal, footsteps across concrete. Outside, the village went about it Sunday morning. "Tell me what you saw," said Miss Marple. "From the beginning. Take your time." Rose had been in the kitchen at Larkspur Cottage on Thursday morning, she said. Not her usual territory. She was parlour, not kitchen. But Mrs. Jennings, the cook, had asked her to fetch the good china down from the high shelf, because Mrs. Al Jennings's back was troubling her, and Rose was taller. She'd got the china down, and was wrapping the cups in the cloth. When Mr. Hartley came in, she hadn't heard him come through the garden. He was simply there, in the kitchen doorway, then in the kitchen, in the way of a man who is accustomed to walking into rooms without announcing himself. "Mrs. Finch asked me to help with the arrangements," he said. "Perfectly pleasant, perfectly normal. She's occupied with guests. I'll take the tea tray through." Mrs. Jennings was at the stove. Rose was at the shelf. Neither of them thought anything of it. "He had something in his pocket," Rose said. "A small paper packet. The kind of thing," she considered, "like a chemist's paper, folded into a square. He had it in his hand for a moment when he came in. I saw it because I was at the shelf and I was looking down, and he didn't know anyone was looking down." She paused. He stood at the tray for perhaps half a minute, perhaps less. Mrs. Jennings was at the stove, and the kettle was loud, and there was a lot going on outside already, guests arriving. He had his back to me. Another pause. When he turned around, the paper wasn't in his hand anymore. Miss Marple's knitting was in her bag, untouched. She had not reached for it. She sat with both hands resting on her handbag, and her eyes on the middle distance, listening with the whole of herself. "Did you see what he put in the tray?" she asked. "Not exactly, not directly."
A 22-year-old packing her trunk, terrified for her life. A small paper packet, folded into a square. Such an ordinary-looking thing. Rose kept this little African violet on her windowsill, the only beautiful thing in a packed, frightened room. He washed his hands until they were pink, scrubbing the backs, the palms, under the nails. Accidents happen to girls who talk too much. It is a terrible thing to use fear as a weapon. 14 months of planning, all culminating in one stolen moment at a tea tray. To witness a murder and have no one to tell, it is a prison of the mind. A peaceful Sunday morning. Church bells ringing, roasts in the oven. He smiled when he threatened her. That detail is the most chilling of all, isn't it? The sun is setting on Mr. Hartley's perfect crime. He burned the paper packet in his fireplace.
But there was only one cup set aside from the others. A larger one, the Colonel's. He always had the large cup. Mrs. Jennings always said so. It was a habit. It was already set out separately on the right side of the tray. Rose's voice had lost some of its flatness now, replaced by something more strained, more present, as though telling it was making it more real than she had wanted it to be. That was the cup with the saucer already under it. The rest were still stacked. She stopped. "I told myself I'd imagined it," she said. "I told myself I was being foolish. He was the solicitor. He was," she searched for the word, "respectable. He'd been coming to the house for 2 years. He and Mrs. Finch were—" She stopped at that. A slight hesitation that said everything without saying anything. "And then the Colonel fell," said Miss Marple. "And then the Colonel fell." Rose pressed the cardigan harder against her chest. "And I thought if I left before, if I went before anyone—" She stopped. Her eyes were bright now, not with tears exactly, but with the exhausting effort of not crying. "He saw me, when everyone was moving about and people were shouting for the doctor. I was standing by the door to the kitchen. I don't know why I was still there. I should have moved. And he came back through from outside, and he saw me standing there, and he smiled," said Miss Marple. "Yes." A silence. "And then he went to the sink," said Rose. "He washed his hands for quite a long time." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Outside, the church bells began, the 11 o'clock Sunday peal, unhurried and entirely indifferent to the particular weight of the conversation happening above the ironmonger's shop on Mill Street. "Rose," she said. Ian waited until the girl looked at her directly. "I want you to understand something. Mr. Hartley is a man who has committed a very serious crime. Men who commit serious crimes and then threaten young women who have witnessed something are relying almost entirely on those young women believing that they are alone." She paused. "You are not alone. You have not been alone since Thursday, though you didn't know it." Rose looked at her. "I'm going to ask you to do one thing," said Miss Marple. "Don't take the 9:15 tomorrow morning. Stay 2 more days. I will come and see you again, and by then I will have spoken to Dr. Trent, and Dr. Trent will have spoken to certain people, and your account of what you saw will be received, shall we say, in the proper manner. Is with proper protection. He said, I know what he said." Miss Marple's voice was perfectly mild. He also chose a poison he believed would pass undetected, in a household where he had free access, in full view of a garden party. He is not, despite his efforts, infallible. Something shifted in Rose's face. Not quite hope. It was too early for hope, but something adjacent to it. The first loosening of a thing held too tightly for too long. "He burned the packet," she said, "that evening. In the sitting-room fireplace. I was passing in the hall. I saw through the gap in the door. He was crouching over the grate, and there was the smell of burning paper." "But you saw it first," said Miss Marple, "before it was burned. That is what matters." She stood, smoothed her skirt, picked up her handbag. She looked at the African violets on the windowsill just for a moment. "Those are very nicely kept," she said. "The secret with African violets is not too much direct light. A bright room, but no direct sun. They sulk terribly if they're too hot." Rose blinked. "Oh," she said, yes, I've had this one 3 years." "They live a long time with proper care," said Miss Marple, "much longer than people expect." She went to the door. Then she paused, one hand on the frame, and turned back with the expression of someone who has just remembered something peripheral. "One more thing," she said. "On Thursday morning, when Mr. Hartley came into the kitchen, was he wearing gloves?" Rose thought. "No," she said slowly. "No, I don't think. No, his hands were bare." "And after he washed them at the sink, could you see his hands then?" "They were—" Rose stopped. Her brow creased. "They were pink, from the hot water, I thought, but very scrubbed. The backs as well, not just the palms." She looked at Miss Marple with the expression of someone who has just understood something they saw 3 days ago. "He was washing something off." "Yes," said Miss Marple simply. "I rather think he was." She said goodbye to Rose and went down the stairs and out into the Sunday morning, with the church bells still ringing and the smell of someone's roast already drifting from an open kitchen window 3 doors down. She walked home slowly, not because she was tired, but because she was thinking carefully about the order in which things needed to happen now. And the order mattered. Gerald Hartley was careful. He had been careful for 14 months, and careful men were difficult. They did not leave obvious traces. They prepared, they planned, they removed evidence promptly, they threatened witnesses with pleasant smiles. But careful men had, in Miss Marple's experience, one consistent flaw. They trusted their own carefulness completely. And the moment one trusted one's own carefulness completely, the moment one stopped imagining that anyone else might have seen, or noticed, or connected, that was the moment one made the small, irreversible error. Gerald Hartley had made his error on Thursday afternoon. He had not looked up at the garden shelf. He had not seen the girl looking down. Dr. Trent telephoned on Tuesday morning at 9:20. Miss Marple was in the garden deadheading her sweet peas when she heard the telephone through the open kitchen window. She came inside still holding a small fistful of spent blooms, set them on the draining board, and picked up the receiver. "Miss Marple." His voice was different. Not alarmed exactly. Philip Trent was not an easily alarmed man, but carrying the particular careful weight of someone who has received information they had half expected, and found upon actual receipt that half expecting it was not the same as being prepared for it. "Yes," she said, "Ramachandran's results came through this morning." A pause. "I sent him the remaining contents of the teapot. There was some left, as it happened, in the kitchen, and a sample from the Colonel's last physical blood work from 6 weeks ago that I retained as a matter of course." Another pause. "Miss Marple." "Yes," she said again, "colchicine. A significant quantity. Consistent with deliberate administration. Not a trace amount, Not contamination, not accidental. Ramachandran is quite certain. A silence. He said, and I want you to understand this is his assessment, not mine, though I find I cannot disagree with it. He said that in a man of 68, with documented cardiac weakness, this dose would have been, he chose the word with evident care, decisive. Within 30 to 40 minutes, mimicking cardiac arrest in every observable symptom. Miss Marple looked at the spent sweet peas on the draining board. The teacup, she said. Gone, as you said. Washed, but the teapot was sufficient. A long exhale on the line. Where does this come from? Colchicine. What plant? Autumn crocus, said Miss Marple. Colchicum autumnale. Very common in English cottage gardens. It's been used in medicine for centuries, gout primarily. Every part of the plant is toxic, the corms especially. She paused. One would need some knowledge to extract it usefully, but not a great deal of knowledge. A careful person with access to the right books and sufficient time could manage it. Trent was quiet for a moment. A careful person, he repeated. Yes. I'll need to contact Inspector Graves. This moves entirely beyond me now. You understand that? Of course, said Miss Marple. I wonder, though, before you do, whether you might also speak to a Mr. Oliver Swan at Mulberry Cottage. He has a folder of documents that will be useful. Bank records and correspondence, primarily. They establish motive and timeline. He's expecting to hear from you. A pause. Oh, you've already spoken to him. He makes excellent coffee, said Miss Marple. She heard something that might, in a less composed man, have been a laugh. And the maid, Rose Binns. She'll speak. She's ready. I would ask that someone, a woman constable if possible, goes to her first, before anyone else does. She's been frightened, and she's been alone with it since Thursday. She needs the thing handled. Miss Marple paused, selecting the word. Gently? It was, she reflected, after she'd replaced the receiver. The one time she'd permitted herself the word all week. She made a fresh pot of tea and took it to the sitting room and sat in the armchair by the window, where the morning light came in at an angle that was kind to aging eyes, and she allowed herself, for the first time since Thursday, to think about the whole of it, not the parts. She had been thinking about parts all week, assembling them, ordering them, but the whole, the shape of it. It was a shape she recognized. Not the specific details, the crocus border, the garden show, the particular venality of a solicitor who had borrowed too much from his client's estate, and persuaded himself that love justified the rest. Those were particular. Those were the Finch matter and no other. But the shape underneath. She thought about the Purvises. It had been the winter of 1929 when the truth about Herbert Purvis had emerged, and even then it had emerged quietly, without drama, in the way things in St. Mary Mead tended to emerge, through accumulation rather than explosion. A word here, a noticeable absence there. A conversation overheard at the draper's counter by old Mrs. Hawkins, who had extremely good hearing and extremely poor discretion. Herbert Purvis had been, as Miss Marple had known for some time before anyone else admitted it, not doing the accounts in the back room. He had been conducting a correspondence, 14 months of it, as it happened, though this parallel would only occur to Miss Marple 22 years later, in an armchair in Chipping Morton, with a woman in Cirencester, to whom he had been, in the legal sense, married since 1921. His marriage to Ada Purvis was therefore not legal, had never been legal. Ada Purvis had known this for approximately 11 of the 14 months. What had struck Miss Marple at the time, and what struck her now, sitting with her tea cooling in her cup, was not Herbert's deceit. Men deceived. It was one of their more reliable qualities. What had struck her was Ada. Ada Purvis had continued to run the shop. She had continued to serve customers with the same pleasant efficiency, the same courteous manner, the same small conversation about the weather and the price of wool. She had continued to smile when Herbert's name was mentioned. She had allowed people to believe, had actively assisted people in believing, that her marriage was ordinary, her household was ordinary, her life was ordinary. She had known it was none of these things, and she had been comfortable with the arrangement. That word again. It had suited her. The surface, the performance, the careful maintenance of appearance. Because underneath the appearance, Ada Purvis had been quietly running that shop entirely as she wished, making all decisions, managing all accounts, answerable to no one. And Herbert in the back room had been, is in the most practical sense, simply not in her way. She had not asked him to stop. She had not asked him to leave. She had asked only that he be discreet. It was, Miss Marple had always thought, one of the more interesting arrangements she had personally encountered. Not admirable, not something she could approve of, but interesting because it illuminated something particular about human nature that more dramatic crimes tended to obscure. Complicity was not always dramatic. Complicity was sometimes simply stillness, the choice not to interfere, the choice to stand behind one's husband and slightly to the left and look pleasant while knowing something that changed the entire nature of what was happening. Dorothea Finch had stood behind her husband and slightly to the left. She had not prepared the poison. Miss Marple was reasonably certain of this. It was consistent with everything she'd observed, with the way Dorothea moved through the world, maintaining surfaces, delegating substance. She had not needed to know the details. Gerald had said so himself, in the garden 3 weeks before it happened. She doesn't need to know the details, but she had known the broad shape of it. She had looked at Gerald Hartley's hand on the tea tray and looked away. That was the Purvis arrangement, translated 22 years forward into Oxfordshire, into summer, into a garden full of marigolds. Different flowers, same dark soil underneath. The difference, Miss Marple reflected, refilling her cup from the pot now significantly cooled, was that Herbert Purvis had not killed anyone. The law was quite particular about this distinction, and rightly so. Ada Purvis had been foolish and selfish and complicit in a deception that had caused genuine harm to at least 2 other people. But she had not stood by while her husband mixed a poison into a man's teacup. Dorothea had. Whether she had known the specific method, the crocus, the paper packet, the careful measuring, was a question for Inspector Graves, and eventually for a court to consider. What she had known was the outcome. She had been informed of the plan, in whatever terms Gerald had used, the garden remedy, the phrase that had its own particular, horrible neatness. And she had said, in essence, "I don't want to know the details," which was not the same as saying no, which was, in fact, the clearest possible way of saying yes. Miss Marple put down her cup. She thought about Rose Binns, above the ironmonger's shop, clutching a cardigan to her chest and trying to decide whether staying was more dangerous than going. She thought about Oliver Swan, sitting in his rented cottage with a folder of careful evidence, and the expression of a man who had been too late to prevent a thing and was living with that. She thought about Philip Finch in Wareham. 41 years old, estranged from a father he had perhaps not loved easily, but had not wished dead, now arranging to learn that his estrangement had been partly engineered, partly maintained, by the woman his father had married, and the man his father had trusted with his legal affairs. She thought about the Colonel himself, barrel-chested, the slight list to the left from the old riding injury, the moustache smoothed when something displeased him, whose 7 consecutive garden show trophies held with the assurance of a man who expected to receive what was correctly his. He had not, as it happened, been a particularly kind man. Mrs. Prout had hinted at this. Rose had confirmed it, obliquely, in the careful way she had spoken about the household, the way she had never once, in the entire conversation, said anything warm about him. He had been a demanding employer, a controlling husband, and a father whose estrangement from his own son had been substantially of his own making. None of which, of course, had anything to do with anything. People were not murdered because they were unkind. If they were, the population of England would be considerably reduced, and Miss Marple's own village would be virtually uninhabitable, and people were murdered because someone had decided that the inconvenience of their continued existence outweighed the risks of ending it. It was, at bottom, a calculation, cold, practical, and in this case dressed up in what Gerald Hartley no doubt experienced as love, but which Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to have some views on the subject, recognized as something considerably more self-serving. He had wanted the woman and needed the money, and persuaded himself these were the same want. The Colonel had been in the way. It was, she thought, extraordinarily ordinary. The most terrible things usually were. She telephoned Rose Binns at 11:30 to tell her that Dr. Trent had been in contact with Inspector Graves, and that a Detective Constable Wheeler, a woman, as Miss Marple had requested, would be coming to Mill Street that afternoon. Rose was to say everything she had told Miss Marple in the same order, without omission. "Will they believe me?" Rose asked. "They will have the toxicology report," said Miss Marple. "Your account provides context and corroboration. On its own it might be questioned, together with everything else." She paused. "Yes, they will believe you." A silence on the line. Then, "He really did it, didn't he? It wasn't just I wasn't imagining." "No," said Miss Marple, "you were not imagining." Another silence, smaller. "All right," said Rose. "All right." Miss Marple replaced the receiver and stood for a moment in the kitchen, her hand still resting on the telephone. She thought about what would happen next with the clear, unsentimental accuracy she had developed over many years of thinking about such things. Inspector Graves would take the toxicology report and Swan's folder and Rose's testimony, and he would build a case that was, in its outlines, not complicated. Gerald Hartley would be interviewed. He would present his careful face and his careful answers, and they would not be sufficient, because careful faces were not in the end sufficient against a dead man's blood work and a frightened maid's testimony and 14 months of documented letters. The question of Dorothea was more delicate. It would depend on what Gerald Hartley did when the careful face was no longer enough. If he protected her, if he maintained to the end that she had known nothing, then the case against her would rest on inference, on pattern, or on the particular quality of her stillness at the moment her husband died. Courts were uncertain about such things. If he did not protect her, Miss Marple had, over the years, formed a view about men who committed acts of violence in the name of love, and were subsequently asked to bear the full weight of those acts alone. Her view was not charitable. Gerald Hartley had a very careful face. But he had been in the back room for 14 months, doing, as it were, the accounts. Sooner or later, careful men talked. Inspector Graves came to Daisy Cottage on Wednesday afternoon. He was a solid, unhurried man of 53, with the kind of face that had been designed by nature for reassuring the recently bereaved and inconveniencing the recently guilty. Broad, steady, revealing nothing except patient attention. But Miss Marple had met him once before, 4 years ago, in connection with a matter involving a forged will and a missing set of keys, and had formed the opinion that he was considerably more intelligent than he appeared, which was, in her experience, the most useful kind of intelligence a police inspector could possess. He accepted tea. He sat in the chair by the window, the same chair she had occupied on Tuesday morning while thinking about the Purvises, and he placed a notebook on his knee and looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent the last 24 hours assembling a picture and wants to know whether the final pieces fit where he thinks they fit. "I've spoken to Dr. Trent," he said, "and Mr. Swan, and the young woman, Rose Binns." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I've read Dr. Ramachandran's report." A pause. "I've also had a constable walk Mr. Hartley's garden this morning, the crocus border, the disturbed section at the eastern end." Graves looked at her steadily. "You walked past his garden?" "I walk past a great many gardens," said Miss Marple. "It is one of the pleasures of village life." He wrote something in the notebook. She had the impression it was not a note about gardens. The section of border showed evidence of recent excavation consistent with the removal of colchicine corms. "We've sent samples of the remaining soil for analysis." He paused. "Miss Marple, I want to ask you something directly." "Please do." "When did you first believe this was a deliberate poisoning? Not suspect, believe." Miss Marple considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Outside the window, a wood pigeon was making its repetitive, slightly mournful observation about the afternoon from somewhere in the apple tree. She listened to it for a moment. "When he washed his hands," she said, "at the kitchen sink before the ambulance arrived. It was the timing of it, you see, not the act itself. One washes one's hands for all sorts of ordinary reasons. But to do it then, with that particular thoroughness, with the Colonel still on the lawn, and people still calling for the doctor, that was the timing of a man removing a specific thing, not dirt, not ordinary soil from a garden, something he had reason to remove promptly." Graves nodded slowly. "The colchicine residue, from extracting or handling the substance." "I assumed something of that kind, yes. I didn't know the specific compound until Dr. Trent telephoned on Tuesday, but the behaviour was consistent with someone who understood they were carrying a trace of something dangerous." She paused. "He was very careful everywhere else. The paper packet, using Mrs. Finch to occupy the cook while he was at the tray, choosing a method that would appear natural in a man of the Colonel's age and condition. He had been careful at every stage. The hands were the one moment he prioritized removal of evidence over appearance of normality. I found it revealing. Most people," said Graves, "would not have noticed. Most people," said Miss Marple, "were watching the Colonel."
Dr. Ramachandran's report from London confirmed it. Colchicine. It is a profound redose. Inspector Graves sat right there and listened. A solid, unhurried man. 14 months of planning ruined by a single moment of panic. Gerald Hartley washed his hands. The trap is perfectly set.
A patch of earth no larger than a dinner plate. That is all it took to hang a man.
I have a view on men who commit acts of violence in the name of love. A solid, dependable man, Inspector Graves. He does not rush and he does not assume. How rare that is today. Cooperation. Such a lovely word. Mr. Hartley is about to be stripped of his clever lies. The wood pigeon sings its mournful song, completely unaware of the tragedies of men. The Colonel took his last sip from a cup, just like this. Then Dorothea stood completely still.
He wrote in his notebook again. The wood pigeon continued its observations from the apple tree. "Gerald Hartley is being interviewed at Chipping Norton Station this afternoon," said Graves. "He came in voluntarily, as which I found interesting." "Did he?" said Miss Marple. "With his solicitor, a colleague from Oxford." A slight pause. "He's presenting himself as cooperative. Concerned citizen. He's expressed considerable distress about the Colonel's death and has offered his full assistance to the investigation." Miss Marple poured more tea into both cups without being asked. "That is very much what I would expect him to do," she said. "At this stage." "At this stage," Graves repeated. "You think it will change?" "I think careful men find voluntary cooperation, when they believe themselves in control of the information available, a useful performance. It establishes goodwill. It positions them as allies rather than subjects." She set the teapot down. "The performance becomes more difficult to sustain once they understand the full extent of what is known. Rose's testimony about the paper packet, the crocus border, the toxicology, Mr. Swan's folder, the bank records." She looked at Graves mildly. "When Mr. Hartley's solicitor has had the opportunity to review the weight of evidence and convey its implications to his client, I expect the cooperation will become somewhat more complicated." Graves regarded her for a long moment. "You've done this before," he said. "It was not quite an accusation." "I have lived a long time," said Miss Marple, "in a village where people are, on the whole, exactly what they appear to be. When someone is not what they appear to be, the contrast is noticeable." He stayed another 20 minutes, asking careful questions, writing careful answers. When he left, he shook her hand at the door with the formal gravity of a man acknowledging something he couldn't quite categorize. And Miss Marple watched him walk down the garden path and through the gate and turned left toward the village with the solid, unhurried movement of a man who knew where he was going. She went inside and washed the teacups and thought about Dorothea. Gerald Hartley's cooperative performance lasted, as it happened, until Thursday morning. Miss Marple learned the details later, some from Dr. Trent, some from Mrs. Prout, who had sources in the Chipping Norton Constabulary that she had cultivated with the same patient dedication she applied to everything, and some from Inspector Graves himself, who telephoned on Friday afternoon with the particular brevity of a busy man who has decided, nonetheless, that certain people deserve to be kept informed. What had happened, stripped of the procedural detail, was this. Gerald Hartley had presented his careful face and his careful cooperation until the moment, sometime on Wednesday evening, when his Oxford solicitor had sat down with him in the interview room and explained, quietly, with the professional compassion of a man delivering genuinely bad news, that the evidence assembled against him was not, as Gerald had apparently believed, circumstantial. It was specific. It was corroborated. It was, in the solicitor's measured professional opinion, sufficient. The careful face had, at that point, undergone some revision. He had asked for the night to consider his position. On Thursday morning, he had made a statement. The statement? He as Graves summarized it to Miss Marple, with the careful neutrality of a man describing a document rather than a human catastrophe, confirmed the essentials. The acquisition of Colchicine Confirmed from his own garden, border over a period of 3 weeks in June and early July. The extraction of colchicine, assisted by a monograph on medicinal plant compounds he had obtained from a university library in Oxford, borrowed under his own name in what Miss Marple privately considered a remarkable act of optimism. The preparation of a concentrated solution, dried to powder, folded into a chemist's paper square. The garden show, the tea tray, the cup set aside. He had described the Colonel's death with the kind of flat, drained precision of a man who has rehearsed keeping a secret for so long that the relief of releasing it has temporarily displaced every other response. He had said, according to Graves's careful summary, that he had believed it was the only way. That the embezzlement would have been discovered within weeks. The Colonel had recently requested an independent audit, a development Gerald had not anticipated. That 14 months of planning for a different kind of future had reduced in the end to a matter of weeks and necessity. He had not initially mentioned Dorothea. Then his solicitor had asked him directly whether Mrs. Finch had been aware of his intentions. There was, Graves said, a silence of approximately 40 seconds. Then Gerald Hartley said, "She knew the shape of it, not the details. I protected her from the details." Miss Marple sat with the telephone in her hand for a moment, after Graves rang off, before replacing the receiver. "I protected her from the details." She thought about that sentence for a long time. It had the quality of a sentence a man constructs very carefully and then lives inside, renovating it when necessary, keeping it furnished with sufficient self-belief to remain habitable. Gerald Hartley had loved Dorothea Finch, or had loved the version of her that existed in the future he'd planned, the version that waited on the other side of the Colonel's death, in London, in a life assembled from the estate money and 14 months of careful preparation. Whether that constituted love in any sense Miss Marple would recognize was a question she set aside, and what she thought about instead was Dorothea's voice when she said, and she had said it to the vicar's wife on the evening of the Colonel's death, in tones that Mrs. Price Ridley had relayed with considerable relish through the village gossip chain. "I suppose these things happen. Not I can't believe it, not I never imagined. I suppose these things happen." The grammar of advanced knowledge. The tense of a woman who had been waiting, not for the possibility, but for the specific Thursday in late July when the possibility resolved into fact. Gerald had protected her from the details. She had not asked to be protected from the outcome. Dorothea Finch was arrested on Friday morning. Miss Marple did not witness this. She was in her garden, which was where she preferred to be on mornings when the world was conducting its necessary business, without requiring her specific presence. She heard about it from Mrs. Prout at noon, who had it from the butcher's boy, who had seen the police car outside Larkspur Cottage at 9:30, and had lingered with the professional dedication of a young man who understands the historical importance of being a witness to things. Dorothea had, by all accounts, come out of the cottage already dressed. Hat, gloves, the cream linen dress from the garden show, or one very like it. She had walked to the police car without being led. She had not said anything to the constable or to the sergeant. She had got into the car with the careful precision of a woman who has decided in advance, how this particular scene will be performed. In the careful face was, it appeared, a quality both of them shared. The village naturally talked about very little else for the following 3 weeks. Mrs. Price Ridley held the view, expressed with considerable frequency at the post office, the Women's Institute, and the churchyard gate on Sunday mornings, that she had always found something not quite right about Dorothea Finch, and that the cream linen dress at a funeral was frankly an indication of character. Mrs. Prout maintained a more nuanced position, noting that the situation was complicated, that there were those who said Gerald Hartley had acted alone and those who said he hadn't, and that in her experience the truth in these matters was usually somewhere in the middle, by which she meant somewhat closer to whatever the current gossip suggested. The Reverend Clement preached, on the Sunday following the arrests, a sermon of such careful diplomatic balance that it conveyed sympathy for all parties, judgment of none, and a general sense of Christian sorrow at the imperfectibility of human nature that left everyone feeling vaguely comforted without being able to say precisely why. Rose Binns did not take the 9:15 to Chipping Norton. She remained at the ironmonger's room on Mill Street throughout, providing a further formal statement to Detective Constable Wheeler, and then a second one 10 days later, when Gerald Hartley's statement required corroboration. She gave both with the clear, steady delivery of someone who has set down a very heavy thing, and found the ground beneath her feet more solid than she'd expected. On the last Friday of August, Miss Marple received a small note in the post. No address, it's just the name Rose, written on the envelope in the handwriting of someone who has learned to write carefully, and means it. Inside, a single sentence. I am staying on. Mrs. Jennings has asked me to help with the autumn preserves. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the small wooden box on her writing desk, where she kept correspondence that mattered. She thought that Mrs. Jennings's autumn preserves would be very good this year. Oliver Swan returned his folder to Philip Finch in Wareham, by registered post in the 2nd week of August, with a brief covering letter, and an invoice for services rendered that was, by his own later admission to Dr. Trent, considerably less than the work warranted. Philip Finch paid it within the week, and added, clipped to the cheque with no covering note, a brief, handwritten line. He didn't deserve her. He didn't deserve much. But he didn't deserve that either. Whether he referred to the Colonel or to Gerald Hartley, Miss Marple was unable to determine when Dr. Trent relayed this detail. She thought on reflection that it referred to both, and that Philip Finch had known it as he wrote it. She found she had considerable respect for Philip Finch, whom she had never met and likely never would. The village garden show was held again the following July. The trophy, unclaimed by anyone from Larkspur Cottage for obvious reasons, the cottage itself now standing empty pending the resolution of the estate, was contested for the first time in 7 years as a genuinely open competition. 3 entries were considered seriously by the judges. Mr. Bassett from Honeysuckle Lane submitted a border of dahlias and late roses of exceptional quality, with the confident modesty of a man who has been waiting 7 years for the field to clear. The vicar's wife offered a cottage garden arrangement of such unruly, cascading abundance that it divided the judging panel entirely, 2 finding it magnificent and 1 finding it alarming. A newcomer, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Okafor, who had moved into the village in April and had in those 3 months done something extraordinary with a previously neglected corner plot, presented a cutting garden of such disciplined beauty that there was a pause when the judges first saw it, of the kind that happens when something is better than expected. Mrs. Okafor won. The village received this outcome with a range of reactions that Miss Marple, who had served again as ribbon assistant, observed with the mild pleasure of someone watching a familiar mechanism produce an unexpected result. Mrs. Price Ridley had views. The butcher's boy thought it was smashing. Mrs. Prout said she'd known from April that the corner plot would be something, and she was not technically wrong. Mr. Bassett accepted second place with good grace, and the private conviction, visible only to those watching carefully, that next year was already his. Miss Marple walked home from the show by the longer route. The evening was warm, warmer than last July, the kind of summer evening that England occasionally produces as if to apologize for the rest of the year. And the light was doing what summer evening light does in the Oxfordshire countryside, which is to make everything look briefly, improbably golden. Of the hedgerows, the stone walls, the front gardens with their roses going leggy, and their pots of pelargoniums blazing orange and red against the old Cotswold stone. She walked past Gerald Hartley's cottage on Vicarage Lane. The garden had been let go. Not badly. Someone, presumably a letting agent or a solicitor handling the property, had arranged for a local man to keep the grass cut and the worst of the weeds from advancing. But the rose border along the front wall had not been pruned, and was producing the wild, abundant, slightly chaotic growth of a plant that has been freed from careful management. The lavender edging the path had spread beyond its original line, and at the far end, between the compost heap and the garden shed, the autumn crocus border was coming back. New growth. The colchicum leaves unmistakable. Broad, bright, ye pushing up from the disturbed earth with the patient, indifferent determination of things that grow in the dark and do not require permission. Miss Marple stopped at the gate and looked at it for a moment. Gardens remembered, she had said to Dr. Trent some weeks ago. She had meant it partly as an observation and partly as something else, the kind of thing one says when one knows it is true, but has not yet worked out all of the ways in which it is true. Standing at the gate in the July evening light, she worked out one more way. The crocus would bloom in October, as it always did. Purple flowers appearing after the leaves had died back, which was the peculiar habit of the colchicum. The flowers came when the plant appeared finished, when everything visible above ground had gone. They came from below, from the part you couldn't see. Next spring someone would buy the cottage. They would walk into the garden and find it mostly manageable. They would perhaps not know the name of what grew in the far border, or its history, or what had been removed from it one summer by a careful man with a paper packet and a plan. They would simply find it growing there, as things grow, with no reference to what had happened and no interest in it. The garden would not remember in the way she had meant. But she would. She stood at the gate a moment longer, long enough to be sure of what she was looking at no longer, then walked on. The sweet peas at Daisy Cottage needed deadheading. They had needed it for 2 days, and she had been putting it off, which was not like her. And she thought that this evening, in the last of the golden light, she would do it properly, or go through them carefully, remove what was finished, leave what was still living to go on. She turned in at her own gate. The garden exhaled around her, warm and green and smelling of the sweet peas she'd planted in April, which had done extraordinarily well this year, better than she'd expected, climbing the trellis her nephew Raymond had put up 3 summers ago, or possibly 4. She found the small scissors she kept on the potting shelf, went to the sweet pea trellis, and began. The village settled into its evening around her. Someone's supper, a door closing, 2 children on bicycles on the road beyond the hedge, arguing about something with the passionate, temporary conviction of children. The church clock beginning its 8 o'clock count. 1, 2, 3. She didn't count the rest. She never did. She knew what hour it was. He spent bloom. This one still had something left. She left it. This one was done. She cut it clean. She thought, briefly and without great weight, about Gerald Hartley, in whichever institution now contained his careful face and his careful habits, and the self-story he was no doubt renovating to make the future habitable. She thought about Dorothea, whose trial was scheduled for October, and whose barrister was, by all accounts, preparing a defence centred on the argument that she had not known the specific nature of what Gerald intended. Miss Marple had no strong views about how the court would receive this argument. Courts were their own thing, with their own logic, and she had learned long ago not to expect them to reach the same conclusion she reached, by the same routes, in the same time. They arrived usually, somewhere in the vicinity of correct. That was, she thought, probably sufficient. She thought about rose bins and the African violets on the windowsill. She thought about Philip Finch in Wareham, who had not deserved any of it. She thought very briefly about the Colonel, barrel-chested, slightly listing to the left, smoothing his moustache on the lawn of his own garden in the last 20 minutes of his life, holding his 7th consecutive trophy with the assurance of a man who expects to receive what is correctly his. She cut the last spent bloom and held the small fistful of finished flowers, brown-edged, soft, entirely done, and looked at them for a moment in the last of the light. Then she dropped them into the trug with the rest. She gathered her scissors and her trug and went inside for tea, and the garden gate clicked shut behind her. "It is a mistake," Miss Marple had said once to Dr. Trent, some weeks after everything had been resolved, or as resolved as these things become, to assume that because something is common, it is therefore not serious. Poison is common. So is greed. So is the particular kind of love that is really only the desire to have things arranged to suit oneself. None of that makes any of it less serious. It simply makes it less surprising. Dr. Trent had considered this. "Does it ever surprise you?" he asked. "Any of it?" Miss Marple had thought about this honestly, which was the only way she knew to think about things. "The cruelty," she said at last, "occasionally. Not the existence of it. That never surprises me. But the particular form it takes, sometimes, the smallness of the thing that starts it. A man borrows money he cannot repay. A woman wants a different life. A garden has the wrong flowers in it." She paused. "The smallness, that surprises me sometimes. Still," she picked up her knitting. "Though I suppose," she added after a moment, almost to herself, "it always starts small. That may simply be the nature of it." The needles began their steady clicking. Outside, the autumn crocus was coming into bud. The end.